We're approaching the end, my friends. So let's get into the muscles, the muscular system. So we got some basic vocabulary. One, myo. The prefix myo is our prefix for muscle, right? So a muscle cell is a myofiber, right? Any muscle is a tissue that can contract, right? So it can change in width. So when a muscle contracts, right, so here's some random muscle in the body, it will go and become thicker and shorter. And that change in width, this contracting here, this is a contracted muscle, and this is a relaxed muscle. And contracting pulls on the tendons, right? Because muscles connect to the bones via tendons. The tendons don't change length. So when that muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendon, which pulls on the bone and moves the bone. So muscles are tissues that contract. There are three types of muscle that we hit when we talked about basic tissues, right? There's the muscles that move your skeleton. Those are the skeletal muscles. Then we have the muscles that line hollow organs. Those are smooth muscle. Then we have the muscles of the heart. Right? The heart is mostly muscle, and that is cardiac muscle. And then skeletal muscle, which moves the bones. So all these muscles, all these muscle types are involved in contracting to produce movement. Whether it's contracting to cause the heart to pump blood, contracting to move something through the intestines, or contracting to, oh yeah, take you to the gun show, whatever. Anyway, smooth muscle, like we said, it lines the hollow organs. Smooth muscle is different from the other muscles because it is spindle-shaped fibers that are packed together. So they have that sort of spindly shape. You have a nucleus, and they contract together. Along the hollow organs, they'll run both lengthwise and top to bottom, so that you can contract from top to bottom and contract from back to front. These are not striated muscles. They do not appear to have stripes under the microscope. We'll contrast this image here with the images of striated muscles. Another big thing about smooth muscle is that it is involuntary. It is not under conscious control. You do not decide when to flex or when to contract what. The movement that these produce is called peristalsis. Right? So if you have your esophagus, here's a piece of food, and you want to swallow that food. So here's your oral cavity, right? There's your throat. And we have the entry to the esophagus right here. Right? So the esophageal muscles right at the top have to relax so that they expand. So as that food enters the esophagus relaxes and it goes in, and then once it gets far enough in that there's muscle on either side, we have this wave, right? So we have relaxation, where the muscles relax and open up around the food as it's traveling down. Contraction above the food. And at the same time, we have a contraction pushing the food further down as well. So we're moving, we're contracting both width and lengthwise. So in order to push things through. And ultimately, that is what these muscles do. These muscles push things through hollow organs. So your digestive system is the gold star example of where to find smooth muscle. And so whether it's the stomach, that's your hollow organ there, whether it's the esophagus above the stomach, or your small intestines and your large intestines, right? Smooth muscle causes that peristaltic motion. Think of it like when a worm moves, right? Part of the worm gets all bunched up, right? It pulls its back end forward and bunches up, and then it relaxes that bunch in order to push itself further forward. So in order to bunch up, it has to contract the muscles this way and relax the muscles this way, and we contract here and here as well. So we have that contraction on both axes. So there you go. That is peristalsis. And you can see it right here. Okay, cardiac muscle. Cardiac being the operative term here, so it is heart muscle. The heart has these extremely thick muscular walls, right? It is thickest right about... My frog is making a ton of noise. Anyway, the heart wall is thickest where it's having to push blood out of the heart. And it is muscle that is doing all that pumping, right? The heart can't pump unless there's muscle contracting. So, where is it again? It's the heart. And again, involuntary, unconscious. You do not have to think, okay, time to pump my heart now, and go, and go. You know, that would kill you. Now, this muscle is striated. It appears striped under microscopy. So when you look at an image, right here is a beautiful example of those striations. We see those stripes, right? Those are the striations of it. They represent what we call contracting units. So whenever you see stripes on either end, that's a portion of muscle that can contract. I don't want to left click. So each of these little spots between stripes is a little contracting unit. So striations indicate that you get a large amount of contractions. This muscle can contract quite a bit. A unique feature of the cardiac muscle is that it is branched, seen especially well here. We got some branches here. So you see all these branches in the cardiac muscle. And then we have intercalated discs. Intercalated discs. Those discs are junctions between cells. So, these contracting units are not individual cells. They're just spots where we can get significant amounts of contraction. The junctions between the cells are these intercalated discs. So, right here and right here. These are nice, beautiful examples of an intercalated disc. And essentially, we share cytoplasm. And what that means is that we share signals. Right? So signals that are used and chemicals that are used for contraction are shared between these cells. And what that basically does is that it speeds up contraction and it helps to synchronize contraction. So, the intercalated discs help those heart muscles contract almost at the same time. So you don't have this wave of contraction. You want this quick contraction to take blood and push it either to the lungs or to the body, right? So that's why you need these intercalated discs, so that we can share cytoplasm, so that we can share contracting chemicals and share the signals for contraction, so that we can get that extremely fast, well-synchronized contraction to push blood. And last but not least, we have our skeletal muscles. These are your voluntary muscles. These are under your control. Oh, I am using my brain, electricity from my brain, to voluntarily control these muscles. Oh yeah, that was weird. These are also striated. So you can see in the image all these wonderful stripes. Right? And again, those stripes represent little areas where we can contract. So, stripes indicate significant ability to contract the muscle. Skeletal muscle is attached to the skeleton. Remembering that the specific type of fibrous connective tissue that attaches it is dense fibrous connective tissue, specifically tendons. Tendons connect muscles to the skeleton. And when the muscle contracts, it puts forces on those tendons, and those tendons then pull the bones around. And that allows movement of the body. So, again, a muscle cell is called a muscle fiber. Just interchangeable. If you see fiber during muscles, that is cell. We call it a fiber because muscle cells sort of have a unique appearance. They are extremely long. These skeletal muscle cells, they're extremely long, consisting of large numbers of those contracting units. So they're very thin, and so they kind of look like a little fiber. Oh, see, now you know why it's called a muscle fiber. Muscle fibers are joined together to form a fascicle. So that is a bundle of muscle cells. So here's an individual muscle fiber. Then when you have multiples together, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in this image. This bundle is called a muscle fascicle. Whoa, hey, getting all over the place. When you get a bunch of muscle fascicles together, right? Here's 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's no set number, but there's a bunch of muscle fascicles joined together with a membrane surrounding it, and this is when you actually have the muscle. Ah! That was supposed to be an underline. Oh well. Okay, let's talk about how contracting a muscle causes movement. And amazingly enough, I've said this like 100 times. When you contract a muscle, that muscle pulls on tendons. So, multiple muscles act together, sometimes on the same tendon, sometimes on, sometimes you have multiple muscles attached to the same basic tendon. So you might have, in this picture, I'm lazy, so I'm just going to draw 2, but they're both attached to one tendon. So sometimes you have multiple muscles working together attached to one tendon, and sometimes the tendons just attach to the same bone, so they do similar work if they're attaching them in the similar spot. Anyway, multiple muscles act together to put forces on the skeletal bone, or on the bones. Now, there's some important vocab here. When we are focused on a single muscle, we will call that muscle a prime mover, right? So if you're talking about everybody's, go-to muscle, when I say muscle, the bicep, right? I know like 80% of you thought bicep, so don't deny it. Anyway, if I'm talking specifically about a bicep, the bicep is the prime mover. So here's my bones. Of the arm. There we go. Oh, so close. There we go. Boom. Okay, so if we are talking about the bicep, specifically, this will be our prime mover. Boom. So, let's see. It's attaching up here. Okay. Anyway, this is your where your scapula and collarbone interface there with your arm, your ball joint at the shoulder. Biceps attaching to those bones. You couldn't do much if it was attached. Anyway, going too detailed. Ignore that. Okay, so this is my bicep. It's my prime mover. Agonists are any muscles that aid in the movement of the prime mover. So you might have the brachialis muscle. So here's your brachialis. This, stop it, man. Go back. Stupid button on the pin. The brachialis is an agonist. Agonist helps the prime mover. Right? And then we have antagonists, and those are muscles that do the opposite action. So, for instance, you might have the tricep. And that is an antagonist to the bicep. So, the tricep has the opposite movement. So, in this case, when the bicep, our prime mover, contracts, we have flexion of the forearm. Right? The brachialis helps with that. So this is our prime mover, the bicep. Then we have the brachialis. And guess what? When the brachialis, whoa, hey, stop it. When the brachialis contracts, it causes flexion of the forearm. They're helping do the same thing. So that is an agonist. And then you have the tricep. You see, when the tricep contracts, it extends the forearm. So, when the prime mover is doing its action, flexion of the forearm, the tricep has to relax. Because it's only when the tricep relaxes that we have that flexion going on. So this is why the tricep is an antagonist. It is an antagonist because when it contracts, it does the opposite. It does something that conflicts with the prime mover. Still with me? Hopefully you're still with me. And here's just another picture. Right? So we were talking about the biceps brachii as our prime mover. So here's our biceps brachii, the prime mover, contracted, and it has caused the forearm to flex. And so there we go. The brachialis is also contracted to help in that flexion, but it's not pictured here. And then we have the triceps brachii here, which must relax in order for that extension to occur. So it is an antagonist. But prime mover is just a term for whatever muscle we're concentrating on. So if we decide that our prime mover is the triceps. Right? If we declare the triceps to be the prime mover now, then the biceps become the antagonist. So, hopefully this isn't so terrible. And here's a nice little just a GIF. And I say GIF with a hard G, you jerks. I'll die before I say GIF. Okay, so there we can see when this muscle contracts, right? It shortens. And as it shortens, the forces pull the forearm up, causing that flexion. And because of that, it has to move. And we also need to relax the triceps in order for that to occur. You can also see as it's extending, the triceps are getting fatter. Right here. If we watch it again, I've got that circle drawn there. Watch the circle. Oop, had to relax, and now it contracts. See that? Okay. So, prime mover, antagonist. All right, let's go into the actual anatomy of the muscle cell. So the muscle fiber is the muscle cell. And again, we call it a myofiber. Inside a myofiber are the myofibrils. These are the striated parts. Okay. So, still with me. The striped areas are the myofibrils. So, inside each myofibril are these microscopic myofilaments. Muscle filaments. Very thin proteins. Here's a few myofilaments. And then this big blue thick one is another myofilament. So these little thin myofilaments are called actin, and this big blue one is called myosin. So these are just specialized proteins that allow for contraction. And these are what actually make up the striation. So, looking at these again, there are two types of myofilaments. We call them the thin filaments and the thick filaments. The thin filaments are actin, and the thick filaments are myosin. Myosin connects to actin with these sort of projections here. These little club-like projections are where myosin attaches to actin. And these are called the myosin heads. So that's a myosin head. And the interaction between the thick filament and the thin filament is how we get contraction. So, let's keep going through it. The contracting unit is called the sarcomere. Right? From here to here is a sarcomere. One of those contracting units. You do not have to remember that either side is called a Z-line. That is like some anatomy and physiology stuff. So all we're really focusing is on the fact that we can change the width of the contracting unit. Right? So this is a relaxed contracting unit. And here is a contracted contracting unit. And you can see that compared to the relaxed one, it has been reduced in width. We've changed the width of the sarcomere. So the sarcomere consists of one set of thin actin filaments and a big old myosin filament with its myosin heads. There are tons of sarcomeres, many sarcomeres in a single myofiber. One myofiber has, I'm just going to leave it at tons because this is, non-majors bio, tons of sarcomeres. So if you look at the image of this relaxed and the image of it contracted, the best illustration I can have of how that works is this. The filaments, right, you can see in the image, the filaments here, the actin filaments are not particularly close to each other. So I could put my hands like this to represent that. And when they contract, I do this. So I'm not actually altering the length. I'm not like breaking down the actin or the myosin and altering the particles of it. I'm just sliding them over each other. I'm sliding them around each other in order to shorten the contracting unit. Look at my wrists. Shorter distance between them now. So we actually call that the sliding filament theory. Come here, you. Arr. So, when many fibers contract, the whole muscle contracts. So within the muscle, sarcomeres contract. When multiple sarcomeres contract, the myofiber contracts. And then when you have a whole bunch of myofibers together contracting, the entire muscle contracts. It's sort of a sum of contractions. Right? The sum of sarcomeres contracting results in how much the muscle contracts. So, degree of muscle contraction is due to the number, the sum of sarcomere contractions. The more sarcomeres contracting, the more the muscle is contracted, right? And we control just how much we want to contract those muscles. The greater amount of myofibers and sarcomeres contracting, the greater the muscle movement. not as many contracting. More sarcomeres, more sarcomeres, more, until it's contracted as much as it can. So, there we go. There's our sarcomeres, there's our thick filament and our thin filaments. I very much like this image. And there they are sliding around each other to produce that contraction. You can ignore anywhere where you see Z line and M line. We can pretty much just ignore that. So, pretty cool. So, sliding filament theory. Basically, the thick filament has those myosin heads. Right? So, we'll stick with the color scheme. Right? We'll just be lazy. Here's a myosin head on that thick filament. And we'll put one on the opposite side like that. Alright? When you have calcium and ATP, it allows actin to bind to the myosin head. Right? So that calcium lets it bind, and then that ATP does a neat little thing. It causes the myosin head to change angle. Right? And when it changes that angle, when it moves, it's got a cool name. It's called the power stroke. Sweet name. When it moves like that, when that power stroke occurs, it pulls the actin towards the center. The actin is pulled and slides around the myosin. So the thick filaments have that cool power stroke that slides the thin filaments towards the center. Once you get that power stroke, ATP detaches and the myosin head reverts back to its original position. And then you just need some calcium to bind it, ATP to power stroke it, and you keep going. So if this is the myosin head, my fingers right here, here's the actin. I get some calcium and it attaches. I get some ATP, power stroke, and then detach, and then attach, power stroke, the power stroke, the power stroke. And the more power strokes you have, the more contraction you get. Right? Woo! So, those thick myosin heads bind and they pull the thin actin towards the center. The power stroke. They release and then you can do it again and again. The power stroke itself requires ATP. Boom. This is just a nice little cross bridge cycle. So, there we go. This is going to have extra information for you. Cross bridge is when the myosin head attaches. And we're going to ignore things like troponin and stuff like that, because this is non-majors. Woo! So, here comes the power stroke. Yeah! Power stroke. And then the ATP detaches. When the ATP detaches, the head detaches. So, ta-da! And it reverts back to its original position. and we're ready to do it all again. All right, so because it is under voluntary control, the nervous system, right, where your neurons are, your brain has to control skeletal muscle. In other words, we have nerves that attach directly to muscle. And those nerves that attach to muscle are called motor neurons. Muscles move, so it's motors, and they're neurons attaching to it. Motor neurons. Woo! So, these are nerves that connect to myofibers. It is not a one nerve to one myofiber. A motor neuron usually has multiple axon terminations along a myofiber, and you usually have more than one motor neuron attaching to a muscle, because let's face it, you have to have a lot of myofibers and a lot of fascicles bundled together to get a muscle. So you need lots of neuronal control. So a signal, an electrical impulse, travels down the nerve, right? And it reaches the end of the axon where the nerve attaches to the muscle. So if this is my muscle, here's my nerve, there's my little trees making the dendrites at one end. We do not care how accurate that is. And there's my axon. I'm going to be lazy and make it 1. So right here is what we're going to talk about. The impulse, my little electrical impulse, travels down until it reaches where the neuron interfaces with the muscle. And the impulse has to send the contraction signal to the muscle. And to do that, we need a neurotransmitter that tells it to contract. We must have a neurotransmitter, right? Something has to tell this gecko's tail to wrap around this pin. So cute. Oh. Okay. Sorry, gecko. Come back here. And that neurotransmitter, abbreviated ACH, it is acetylcholine, right? ACH is released from the axon here across the synapse, right? Wherever a neuron interfaces with either another neuron or the muscle, that's a synapse, that little space between them, right? This is the synapse. It releases that acetylcholine out into the space. And then there are receptors that attach to acetylcholine. And once they attach to acetylcholine, they generate the impulse that tells the muscle to contract. So the impulse continues along the muscle. And as long as acetylcholine is attached, we get continuous impulses. So acetylcholine, as long as the acetylcholine is attached to the muscle receptors, the muscle will contract. It basically cannot stop sending out the contraction impulse until acetylcholine is removed. By the way, that happens due to a fancy little enzyme that breaks it down called acetylcholine esterase. Acetylcholine esterase. This is an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. So, when I do this, right, if I keep it contracted, that means there's acetylcholine being released to the bicep and the brachialis and various other muscles in there. And as long as I'm keeping it contracted, that acetylcholine is there. And if I want to relax it, like that, as soon as I'm relaxing it, that means acetylcholinesterase is removing acetylcholine. If the acetylcholine's there, the muscle is contracted. The more acetylcholine there is, the more and longer the contraction occurs. So, pretty cool. So, acetylcholine binds to muscle receptors, sends the impulse down the muscle, and produces that contraction. And again, it stays contracted till acetylcholine is released from those receptors by good old acetylcholinesterase. And that is what allows the muscle to relax. Without acetylcholinesterase, there is no relaxation. Alright, so that is the motor neuron. And then we describe the neurons interfacing with muscle fibers as motor units. Right? So a motor unit is a motor neuron and all the fibers it controls. Right? You can have very few neurons controlling a lot of fibers. When you have few neurons controlling a lot of fibers, you get what we'll call coarse movement. Right? Because a signal down a neuron says, contract! And it tells an awful lot of muscle cells to contract at once. Right? So the more neurons you have, the finer control you have. Right? So fewer neurons gets more muscle cells to contract at the same time, causing a coarser movement. Right? So your lower back, there's not a lot of very fine gradation, right? When I contract my lower back, like I can do a couple of little things, right? There's some fine movement. In general, there's not nearly as many neurons as, say, a finger gets, right? The muscles down here that are controlling the flexion of my fingers, right? The muscles are actually down here in the forearm, and they pull on tendons that go all the way under here. So these muscles down here, right, they have a lot of neurons to the motor unit, right? More neurons in the motor unit produces more precise movement. I can control the amount of flexion in this finger and my thumb to an extreme fine degree. Think of all the fine movements we can do with our fingers. And that's because the muscles controlling that have just a ton of motor neurons interfacing with them. You can get to, in some muscles that have extremely precise movement, you can get to the point where you have one neuron per muscle fiber. Like the movement of the eyes is pretty darn close to one neuron per muscle fiber. It's not there, but it's close. So, your eyes do a lot of very, very, very precise movement. Where'd you go? Yeah. Oh, trying to jump away. Hi. Hi. Nose boops. Boop, 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 boop. Yeah, you hate that. Come here. All right. Now let's get on to talking about specific muscles. If this were anatomy and physiology, this is where you would beat your face into a wall as you have to memorize just a ton of muscles. This is Bio 1000. You are not memorizing an awful lot of muscles here, but we're talking about some very common ones that people think about, with, of course, the bicep being the first one we'll mention. So these are a selection of muscles from the arm and the shoulder that I want to talk about. The bicep, right? Bi meaning two, cephalic, ceph, heads, two heads. And when we look at a bicep where it attaches, we attach in two spots. Right? So the bicep has the short head and the long head, and that's why it's called the bicep. And its whole job is flexion of the forearm. You know what? Let's off to the right here. Let's talk a little bit about movements, because when bones move, we talk about them in different ways. So in general, flexion is where you reduce the angle between bones. Right here is around 180 degrees, and I'm going to flex it to 90 degrees, right? 45 degrees, right? That's flexion. I'm reducing the angle between bones. Extension is obviously increasing the angle between bones. And we have flexion of the forearm, right? And then there's flexion of the arm on a whole. There, I've just flexed the arm, right? So that is flexion and extension. So, actual biological definitions here. The triceps, action, right? So when I say action here, what I mean is what happens when the muscle contracts. Action, the biceps action is to flex the forearm. The triceps action is to extend the forearm. So this image here, now that I've written over it, that sucks. Also, my face is over it, so let's try and go here. But you can see yellow, red, and green representing the three heads of the tricep, and they attach in different positions. So when you open this PowerPoint in your own computer, you can see those three heads much easier. All right, next thing is the supinator muscle. So we have some new movement, right? Now we have pronate and supinate. Now this is all about the wrist. So, pronation is where you go palms down. Pronate is where you flip the wrist palms down. And supinate is where you show me that there's nothing in my hands. right? If I want to show you my gecko, I have to supinate, and if I want to hide him, I pronate. So, you'd move your wrist so that your palms are down and up is a terrible description here. I mean, it's relative. Just supinate, pronate. Hi, little one. So, the supinator, amazingly enough, its action... I'm holding you in suspense here. Is to supinate the wrist. Oh my God. Now, an important thing about this is that pronation and supination does not involve the elbow. Your elbow should stay still. Right? In other words, when I am pronating and supinating, my forearm is not flipping, or my upper arm is not flipping in any way. Ah, careful, little one. Okay. Come here. I'm covering the camera. I'm too vain to be invisible. So, you are not flipping your elbow. If your elbow's moving, you are rotating the arm. Right? That is a completely different motion. Right? Because if you watch my fingers, if I'm rotating, my bicep is changing position, my upper arm is changing position. So, supination, no movement at the elbow. Okay, the deltoid. Got a belch there. This is an important muscle. Deltoid might be one of the things you think of when you think of your shoulder muscles. When people think about their shoulder muscles, they generally think of two muscles. They're deltoids, which are about here, and the trapezius, which is here. So, trapezius is a back muscle. We'll talk about that in a bit. The deltoids. Their whole job is to flex or extend the arm. Flex the arm. Flex, extend. Flex, extend. Right? Now, we have a lot of mobility in the joints between our scapula and our humerus. So we can hyperextend our arm and send it back behind us. Like, you know, if you're in a Japanese cartoon and running really fast, you got to hyperextend those arms. Otherwise, you know, how do people know you're running? Lame joke. Now, another one, another set of movements is when you move away from the body or towards the body. I like to think of this as bird flapping, right? So here we are talking about, I'm running out of space. Let me check if I'm about to, okay. I have just a little bit of space right here. Our next set of movements are abduction and adduction. You can abduct and you can adduct. When you abduct, you move something away from the body, right? So I'm going to abduct my arms like that. If I want to adduct, I move them towards the midline. Right? So when we talk about anatomy and physiology, we'll often talk about the midline, which is right now. And so abduction and adduction is all about moving away from the midline or back towards the midline. So the deltoid abducts the arms. Right? Boom. This is adduct. It is not a deltoid thing. Come back here. You're falling. Just come up here to my shoulder, buddy. Okay, the rotator cuff. Amazingly enough, the muscle movements in the rotator cuff are all about rotation. No one saw it coming. What a twist! The rotator cuff. So there's actually a number of different muscles that you don't have to memorize. We have the infraspinatus. We have the supraspinatus, the subscapularis, the teres major. We've got a lot of different muscles connecting basically between the scapula, the shoulder blade, and the head of the humerus, right? And those muscles working together can rotate your arm. So, rotation is occurring with the rotator cuff. It's a bunch of very small muscles. Those can be torn actually relatively easily. So when you hear rotator cuff injury, what they're saying usually is that there's damage to the tendons or the muscle in the rotator cuff. And that will actually prevent you from being able to get full rotation of that arm. And that will significantly inhibit your ability to use that arm to its fullest extent. Anyway, multiple muscles make up the rotator cuff, and it rotates the upper arm in the socket with the scapula, the shoulder blade, and the clavicle, the collarbone. Okay, done with the upper arm. Woo! All right, on to the chest. So, really, chest and abs. Anyway, the pectoralis major, your pecs. When you think of your pecs, you're actually thinking of your pectoralis major. There is a pectoralis minor connected sort of underneath your pecs and helping them out. They're an agonist for the pec major. Anyway, the pec major is the big one. And it helps move the arms towards and away from the chest. So it helps with towards the chest, adduction, and it even helps with abduction. Clapping like a seal. Sweet. Very respectable stuff to do in a video as a professor. Next up is the rectus abdominis. So when people think of your abs, there's actually a number of different muscles involved at different depths that make up your abdominal muscles. But that sweet six-pack comes from the rectus abdominis. So these muscles, when they contract, they produce flexion in the spine. So in the torso, in other words, it's spinal flexion. So the crunch, right? When you do them exercises, like I be doing them crunches day and night. Those are the rectus abdominis. There's a lot of muscles that we're skipping over because you're non-majors. So that's like good for you, but at the same time, it's fun to learn about a lot of these. The other abdominals are underneath this layer, and they move at different angles, right? So you'll have the obliques, and then you'll have so those layers like that. Anyway, they have opposing movements, and those different layers of abdominals allow you to do the twisting stuff. So that's kind of fun. Okay, so like I said, we're skipping a lot. Selected muscles of the back. The erector spinae is a very large, very strong muscle that attaches all along the spinal cord. Spinae being in the name, you know it does something with the spine, and erector means that it holds the spine up, so its action, in other words, when it contracts, it extends the spine. So, you know, when you're being lectured by someone, and they're like, extend that or contract that erector spinae, young man. Stand up straight. So, holds that back straight. It extends the back. Then we have the trapezius, which is a layer further towards the surface. The erector spinae is a really deep muscle. And when you look at the trapezius, it has a trapezoidal shape. Trapezius. Anyway, this image makes it sort of triangular because we're ignoring where it's coming over. Moving on. I'm going on a tangent. So it's got that trapezoidal shape, and its whole job is a lot of stuff, right? It is a versatile muscle. One, we can see that it attaches to the scapula, right? This here, let's get another color in there. This is the deltoid. So the scapula is underneath there in this image. All right, so we're sort of mentally putting in the scapula around here. So the trapezius has attachments to the scapula, and thus it can move it and shrug. So it can shrug that scapula. Shrug it, baby. So in addition to that, by the way, there is a special name for that shrug. Elevate. So when it elevates the scapula, you are shrugging. So that is elevating. The trapezius can elevate the scapula. When you're stressed out and that trapezius unconsciously contracts, you might find yourself elevating that scapula without noticing it, and it can actually cause a pretty big knot and a lot of pain if you keep it contracted for too long. So you might, if you're stressed, take a moment and figure out what's going on with your shoulder blades and relax them if you can, because it sucks to get that pain. All right. Now, it can also flex the skull. So we see attachment to the skull in this image. right here, it's attaching to the skull. Now, it's got a small attachment point right at the back. So, when that trapezius flexes, it's only pulling on one part of the skull. So, it pulls the skull back, causes flexion, right? But at the same time, because it's only pulling on one side, it also causes rotation. So the skull pulls back and rotates. That's what the trapezius does when it contracts up at the skull. We rotate and pull back. It does both of those things, rotate and flexion, rotation and flexion of the skull with relation to the neck and spine. So, what was that? What was going on up there? That's the trapezius, baby. So, shrug. And that thing right there. Oh, I think I got water in my ear. What's going on there? That is also the trapezius. And that is neck flexion. So that is not the skull. That is the neck. Because what's happening is it's also attached all along the neck vertebra. So, all along here. And it can pull on these muscles, or these attachment points to move that. So, if you put your hand up against your trapezius, you can feel these things, right? So, this big muscle right here that you would think of when you think of like a neck rub or a shoulder rub, this is trapezius. And so, if you trace it into your neck, it's hard to isolate from some of those other muscles. There's a bunch in there, but you can feel the contraction if you're in the right spot. You can feel the contraction of that muscle. So, you can also feel relaxation and other muscles contracting, but anyway. Probably the easiest one to feel the contraction of is when you elevate your shoulder blade. Okay. Now it's on to selected muscles of the legs. So, we're going to include the pelvis here too, because a lot of these leg muscles attach or insert at the pelvis. And we're also going to be real broad with this, because a number of these leg muscles we're going to call by the group. For instance, there is a quadriceps group and a hamstring group. And these are multiple muscles. Right? So, we'll talk about that a little, but you're responsible for knowing the groups, not so much the individual muscles. But first off, let's talk about what a lot of people love, and that's big gluteus maximus. I cannot lie. So, the gluteus maximus is one of the most massive muscles in the body. It has a lot of mass. And that's because it does a lot of important stuff. It actually goes a lot further than you think. When most people think gluteus maximus, they think their butt. And of course, they're right. Where is this? Oh, yellow. That's why I'm not seeing anything. I'm feeling purple. Right? Of course, there's the butt. Right? The gluteus maximus is what causes that butt to pop. But it's not just the butt. as you can see in the image, it actually wraps around and comes around the front of the leg and actually inserts over by the knee. So, it's a very large muscle with an entire strap of it extending around to the front. So yeah, think of it as your butt, but it's much more than that. Now, it extends the leg. And when you extend the leg, you are putting your leg back behind you. That is a leg extension. Right? So the leg goes back behind you when you are running. Leg extension. So, extend. Extend. So, I can hyperextend, but I'm on a chair, and I don't want this to be my last will and testament as well as a lecture video. It is also involved in rotating the leg, the entire leg. So, no need to talk about what that is. It's rotation, people. And then it helps stabilize the knee joint. So, very important. There's a lot of forces going on. Your legs are getting the full mass of your body when you are moving around. And so the knee joint takes a lot of force. And so you need muscles to stabilize that knee joint when it's moving. So that's the gluteus maximus. There's a minimus, and we're just going to ignore it. On to the quadriceps group. There are actually multiple muscles in the quadriceps group. And the quadriceps group is an agonist of the gluteus maximus, or the gluteus maximus is an agonist of the quadriceps. Anyway, it helps move that leg back. It also helps with knee extension, right? Because there are multiple muscles here, there's going to be multiple actions, right? We're talking like here, there's just 1, 2, 3, and 4 different muscles right there. So, knee extension, kicking that soccer ball, right? So, knee flexion, knee extension, flexion, extension. Ha! Whoa! If my kung fu were stronger, that could have been bad. Then we have the hamstring group. Again, a group of multiple muscles. Leg flexion. So moving that entire leg forward. So if you're in a chorus line, you got a kick, and that is leg flexion. And then knee flexion and knee rotation. You can get a small amount of rotation in your knee joint. If you dislocate your patella, you can get a large amount of rotation, but it's not good. And then finally, the gastrocnemius. So, the gastrocnemius is what you think of when you hear the word calf, as long as you're not thinking baby cows. So, when I say your calf muscle, you're actually thinking of the gastrocnemius. Big old muscle right here. Huge, thick muscle. It actually plays an important role in the cardiovascular system, so that'll be cool when we learn about that. But, of course, the gastrocnemius is attached to the Achilles tendon. So, that giant Achilles tendon that then attaches into the heel bone being the calcaneus, but we didn't make you learn that. Anyway. And this is an agonist of the hamstrings. When it comes to the knee, it is involved in knee flexion. And it is involved in moving the foot. So, the last thing we'll mention as far as movement goes is dorsiflexion Whoa, hey, it's doing that thing again. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So, dorsiflexion is basically sticking your your toes in the air, right? You can actually feel that happening. You know what? This might work better if I try and... Okay, so here's my foot and point my toes up. There we go. So, and if you're standing and you do it, you can actually feel a bunch of muscles contract in order to do that. And that is your gastrocnemius doing that dorsiflexion. And then plantar flexion is when you do this. So it's hard to dorsiflex when my foot is not on the ground, something like that, and then it's easier to plantar flex. Hard to tell when that stuff is in front of the camera. So if that turned out filming nothing, use your imagination to fill it in. Anyway. Alright, last of the selected muscles is breathing. So take a moment, close your eye, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in. Who's that behind you? Okay, anyway. The muscle involved in breathing for us mammals is the diaphragm. You don't have a diaphragm, do you? No, you don't. You're a lizard. You don't get a diaphragm. All your breathing is from the muscles around your ribs. Cutie. He can't breathe when he's running. When he runs, he can run as far as he can get with the last breaths he took, and then he has to stop and take a moment. He can do a small amount of buccal pumping. It's kind of visible right there. You can see the bottom of his mouth sort of coming out there. That's a buccal pump trying to get air into his lungs. But his heaviest breathing is done from his ribs. He has to contract these muscles to do his breathing. Contract and relax those. We, us mammals, get a kick-ass diaphragm. Now the diaphragm is very cool because it's also a way to separate out the internal hollow area of the human body. Above the diaphragm is the chest cavity, and below the diaphragm is the abdominal cavity. It separates them. It is a big muscle. And this one seemed a little counterintuitive to me. When it contracts, the muscle flattens and the chest cavity gets a little bit bigger. So that's actually contraction. Makes sense if you pay attention to the energy, like the effort you're putting into breathing. Because breathing in takes a lot more energy than breathing out. And so it makes sense that it would flatten out. Even though we've been thinking about contraction as the muscle getting like shorter and fatter, in the diaphragm, contraction flattens it and it pulls the lungs down. And an accessory to that are rib muscles and back muscles pushing your chest out and up. Anyway, diaphragm contracts and it flattens and your lungs are pulled down. Woo, that anyway, when it does that, it stretches them out and there's more volume in there. Basically, it expands the lungs, and suddenly you have a situation where there's a higher pressure of air outside than inside your lungs, so air rushes in, right? And when it relaxes, it pushes up the lungs and increases the pressure inside the lungs so that the air rushes out. Your lungs have no muscle to them. They are gas sacs. So it is entirely the diaphragm and the chest cavity moving around that concerns whether or not you can breathe in or out. So when it relaxes, the lungs are pushed up. It compacts the lungs and the air is pushed out. When it contracts, the diaphragm is pulled down, the lungs stretch out, and there's low pressure in the lungs and air rushes in and you inhale.